Brilliant. So welcome to the second of the FarmED podcasts in the new series. I'm the presenter, I'm Fiona, and I'm the marketing person at FarmED. And I'm very excited to talk to Ian, who is the
Hello.
FarmED founder, and I know quite well. But we're going to talk today about crop rotations. Now, when I was at school, before I came to work with you, Ian, my only knowledge of crop rotations was Turnip Townsend, who I studied for my O-level history.
Yes,
and
of
he was
course.
the father of the 4-crop rotation. Now, I know we've got an 8-crop rotation here, so let's just go back to basics and explain what is a crop rotation in farming terms.
Gosh, Turnip Townsend. I haven't thought about him for a long time. Of course, the Jethro Tull with his seed drill and all
those
these things
people,
that
agricultural
we've forgotten. And it was a revolution, wasn't it? But I mean, you've got to go back thousands of years actually to think about crop rotation. It's something that's been happening for a long time. Farmers have known that if they rotate crops, that they can reduce diseases and pests and all sorts of things and get fundamentally a better sustainable system by having a crop rotation. And what it means is you're not growing the same thing all the time in the same place. So if you grow something that builds up a disease, so one crop of wheat or carrots or whatever it might be, if you keep doing that, your disease may well wipe your crop out. If you move the crops through a crop rotation, you can stop a lot of those problems. You can also do other things, like, for example, so clover was in your Turnip Townsend textbook, I should imagine. And the clover, we know now through modern science, but the clover is a plant that can build nitrogen into the soil, which is the plant's protein. So if you're growing a crop for humans to eat, then you need protein to grow the crop for the crop's sake. Well, nitrogen is the thing that the crop needs in the soil. And nitrogen fixing plants like clovers and peas and beans, and the Romans knew this. For thousands of years we've known this. You can improve the quality of your soil with your crop rotation, which means that then you're much more sustainable and not so reliant on synthetic products. And worldwide, I mean, we use a lot of synthetic products to grow this food. The big crops that we grow have a lot of inputs, and it does. We've certainly increased the yield.
When
of
you
crops.
say inputs, just explain.
What does
inputs
in this case, I'm referring to fertilizers.
Right.
We use in some parts of the world we're overusing fertilizers. In other parts of the world we're underusing them, perhaps, where people perhaps can't afford them or don't have access to them in different parts of the globe. But we know that these products have a detrimental effect if they're overused on our natural environments. So we have to figure out ways of developing farming systems which are rebuilding, regenerative, more than sustainable. And that will largely, with crops, come down to crop rotation. And thinking about having, like Turnip Townsend did 200 years ago, I'm a bit rusty on my history.
300, isn't it?
300.
800,
Okay.
No, wait, no, actually 1800, so 200 years ago, you're right. Yeah.
So somewhere around there, we'll agree to know that one.
Around that time.
But about 200 years. So they, previously people had a fallow, and where they wouldn't grow a crop in thinking that it would build fertility. And then, sort of perhaps in the Dark Ages, that was a sort of common theme. But it's this crop rotation that's important. It's thinking about the succession of different crops that follow one another. And if you think about, our landscape when we drive around in our cars and look over the hedge or the fence to see the crops that are grown, very often you see this just as one big crop, don't you? And wheat or oilseed rape or whatever, grass. And the question is there a rotation going on? And because it happens infrequently, so the crops, in the case of growing a crop of corn like wheat or barley, you're planting those once a year. So next year it might be oilseed rape, or it might be potatoes, or it might be sugar beet, or whatever. But there is a crop rotation going on most farms. Some are simple, without much diversity, and others are highly complex, which might run over 9, 10, 12 years even.
So would they generally change every year? Would you definitely see you to have a crop growing in a field for 1 year and the next year be something different in that field, or not always yearly?
Well, not always, because you can grow sometimes more than one crop in a year, of course. Other times you might grow perennial crops. So think about our grassland, which covers 2/3 of the country, the UK. That's often perennial, permanent, down for more than 5 years, let's say. But we might also have a wheat crop that's sown in the autumn and then harvested in the summer. So, which is, what is that, 9 months, 10 months? So it depends very much on the plant, the crop that you're talking about, as to how long it stays in the ground. But what we tend to see when we look at the landscape in the countryside is these, the combines roll, the plough or not these days. You see a change.
That's a subject for another podcast, isn't it?
Oh, gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? But anyway, let's not go there on this one.
No, absolutely not.
Talking about crop rotation, what's important is that you get something that's sustainable. So sustainability in terms of, environmental sustainability is one thing, soil sustainability, economic sustainability. I mean, all farmers want their soil to be in better condition than it was, when they took it on. Everybody's objective is to build soil so that it's more productive and it's more efficient and it's more economically viable. That's what we all want. So anything we can do with a crop rotation to do that is in our interests. Sometimes we don't do that. And if you continue to grow the same thing on land for a long period of time, you may well deplete your natural capital, your soil, and the resource that's, is finite. I mean, there isn't any more of it for a start. So we've got to be careful, very careful with our soils. Everyone talks about it globally. Everyone says, oh, we must look after our soils. Presidents of America and they've put it in statute. I mean, it's been such an important thing. And yet, actually, we don't always do it. And it's really, for me personally, I'm really worried about it. I mean, I've seen a slow and almost imperceptible change in the soil, often as a result of lack of rotation, a lack of diversity. I mean, for me, it's really clear. And I think that's a big problem. So crop rotation is very important that people understand.
And the predominant reason for it is for soil health and for...
For me, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So talk us through the crop rotation here at FarmED and what's how many years it covers and what's growing in each plot when?
Well, when we came here 10 years ago, we had there was, on half of the farm, there was no crop rotation. And where the arable crops were grown, so these are corn crops, and I say corn in the sense of, well, that's what we sort of think of more collectively, so cereal crops, so barley, wheat, oats, that sort of thing. And on this particular farm, there was no rotation, and it had been growing continuous cereal crops, corn crops, for 50, 60, 70 years.
So when you say continuous, you mean, oh right, so when we think of intensive agriculture, which is obviously a word that is talked about a lot, that is a form of agriculture that doesn't do rotation. Is that correct?
Well, you could. There isn't a. I don't think there's a definitive answer because every farm's different. Every farmer's interpretation of intensive agriculture is different. It depends on your topography, which way you face, how old you are, how you were trained, what you're interested in, what your family wants to do, what what the previous farmers did, what the soil can do, how much rain you get, how hot it is, what's the altitude. So many things affect the way you farm. So you have to see every farm as being different. But I think that there's, certainly, we've simplified the crop rotations, that's for sure, in our arable sector. And there are millions of acres of arable land, and it represents, roughly a fifth of the UK is growing these annual crops. And I say annual crops, so that's the ones that are replaced every year. Sown seed, harvested, roughly a year later. And that's where the crop rotations should be implemented more, in my opinion. And we've simplified them right down. On this farm, there wasn't one in the end. So we were growing the same crop year on year on year. And the reason that's important is because it's totally dependent on the products that we're putting on, like the fertilizers and the weed control that we can do. We're very good at it. And it does yield a lot of, food, but it's not rebuilding the soil. And there's my problem. That's the problem I have with it. And so for me, I feel like we want to improve that. So what we've done on this farm, sorry to answer it a long way around.
Yeah, no, it's great, absolutely. The history's really important, isn't it? What was going on here before is really important, and how it's been changed. So
absolutely. So what we wanted to do was to increase the level of diversity on the farm, because we know that's great for wildlife and for lots of reasons, so salt, water infiltration and so on. But we wanted to do it particularly to show that we could build soil again and not do it by spending a lot of money. That we don't have huge amounts of carbon, organic matter, for farmyard manure and things to put back on the farm, because there wasn't any here. So we have to build it with our crop rotation. So we have an 8-year crop rotation. So that's the length of time it takes to go around in one big circle of doing the different things that we do here. And we have half of that as grass. We call it a ley. It's a temporary ley that's in the ground for 4 years. And that's a multi-species mixture. It's called a herbal ley. If you listen to the Archers, you'll know all about that. I'm sure you do.
I do.
Being the agricultural story consultant at the moment, I know you do. But the thing about it is that there's nothing new about this. This is like back to Turnip Townsend. You know, we've been using these complex mixtures for fertility building, improving our soils in crop rotation for hundreds of years. And in this case, today on this farm, we're using a 17-way mix, which contains different grasses, different clovers, and different herbs, called a herbal ley. And the reason we use that mixture for 4 years in our 8-year crop rotation is to build fertility, to provide food for our livestock that we have on this farm. So we have sheep and cows on this farm. They need to be fed and they consume grasses and forage in the form of these pastures that we grow. After 4 years, when we plough it in, we've then got a reservoir of fertility, and then we grow our cash crops. And we call them cash crops because these are things we can sell directly. So wheat, for example, oats, things like that. And we can grow those crops after we've grown our 4-year fertility building ley or pasture, and we can grow them without the need for fertilizers or weed killers and other expensive items. So if you're a farmer, you know, the cost of living crisis for you right now is fuel, fertilizer and feed for your animals. So if we can minimize those costs, or in our case, we don't have any or very little fuel, we buy some diesel, that's good news. Of course, we have to accept that we're working with a natural system, therefore we won't necessarily get the peak in yield that we might get with a lot of fertilizer application. But if we can sell our food that we can grow here, and that's a big if, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in other occasions, then we can do it profitably if we shorten that supply chain. And that's what we're doing on this small 100 and something acre farm.
Amazing. So you've got your 4 years for your herbal ley, and then you take that out and you put your cash crop in. And do they stay in? Is that the next 4 years then? Is that how that works?
So
we go back into herbal ley?
Correct.
Yeah.
So we grow 4 years of a number of different crops which we can sell or we get subsidy for. We still get a bit of subsidy for environmental delivery of things for the public good. So that would be things like cover crops, for example. And we have a wild bird seed mixture that we're growing at the end of our rotation for a few months to feed birds in the winter. And that's at the end, and then we go back to our grass ley. So we're growing food, we're growing wildlife habitats, we're improving soils, and we're making it economically viable on this farm.
So for a farmer who's trying to make money and running a business, they'd have some of their fields in the herbal leys for soil improvement, and then they'd be using those because they'd be grazing their livestock on them, wouldn't they? So they'd be getting some value from those, and then they switch over to the cash crops for half the farm or whatever, so that they're getting money from some. That's how it works?
Yeah, and that's not different to Turnip Townsend.
No.
He was growing turnips, of course, hence the name, and he was also, which is an animal food, and he was also growing clovers as part of his 4-year crop rotation. So there's nothing new in any of this. We're just reinventing it for our modern times. And the reason that crop rotation is appealing now is because we can sequester, if we do it in a way that sequesters carbon. In other words, we're taking, through photosynthesis, we're taking carbon dioxide, which is a nasty gas, as we all know, warming the planet. We can lock that back into soils.
So explain how that works. That's obviously another thing. Everyone's talking about carbon on every level, aren't they now? That's really important. So just explain the way that crop rotations help with the carbon issue and how that works.
So if you think about our arable land, where historically we've been tilling the soil a lot, in the process of tilling the soil and in the process of applying fertilizers in particular, we are releasing a lot of CO2. So the greenhouse gases in agriculture, there's 3 of them, they're really important. CO2, nitrous oxide and methane. It's not a school lesson, but you know, those are the three biggies. If you're manufacturing fertilizer, you may think, oh, it's the nitrous oxide that's coming off the fields when we put the fertilizer on. Well, there is that, and that does happen. But it's also the manufacture of the fertilizer in the first place by using oil or gas to make your nitrogen fertilizer, because that emits CO2 big time. So there's a number of things, not just in the fields when we apply it, but also the externalities up and down stream, if you like, of the world that we're working with agriculture. So emissions are a really big problem. So one, if you stop the emissions and not use these products, does that mean that you don't have any production? Well, the answer would be yes, we would lose. We would get to a cliff edge and have very little yield, so less food, if we take the fertilisers away. What can we do about that? How can we get over that? Well, we need to rebuild our soils. So we need to rebuild our soils by having a crop rotation that is deliberately designed to increase the fertility of the soil. It is time consuming. It takes years to do this, but that is the bottom line. We will run out of road eventually with our soils. You remember the Dust Bowls in America. Back again to our history lessons, keep doing the same thing on land, it will just turn into sand. These things have happened, in previous generations. Every nation survives or falls on the strength of its soil. So we have to rebuild soils. It's a fundamental thing we have to do. We're nowhere near self-sufficient in food in this country. The soil, we're in a temperate climate. We can grow crops really well, but we have to nurture and look after our soil. I nearly used the word cultivate then, but thought better of it.
Different meanings to do, absolutely. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So when people talk about regenerative agriculture and agroecology, crop rotations are a fundamental part. You can't really have regen ag and agroecological farming without crop rotations. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely, because you need diversity, and but that's a really good way of putting it. And it's what farmers for the last 400 generations have always known. It's only in the last, my generation, maybe the one before, where we were thinking, well, with synthetic products, we can absolutely make, we can make this system work, which we have. But it was the unintended consequences that we didn't foresee and that we're now aware of that we're addressing. And that's why I think crop rotation comes back into the limelight right now, because there is a climate emergency. Farmers farm so much of the land on the planet. I mean, this country, it's over 70%. Worldwide, it's about half. And that's where all our food comes from.
Absolutely.
So if you don't look after the soil, you have a big crisis, and it's a global crisis. We can see the geopolitics playing out in the world all the time, and they always, I'm afraid, probably will, where you get distortion. Suddenly the markets go wrong. A lot of people on the planet to feed. We need to be very mindful of our bottom building blocks of our agricultural foundations, which is soil. That's why it's important. So crop rotation enables us to fix that.
And does crop rotation happen all over the world? We're not talking a British way of farming or I mean,
it's all over the world, but different. It's applied differently. The principles are applied differently. And I suppose where you wouldn't have a crop rotation is where you have perennial cropping. So if you think, for example, we have an orchard here. My expectation of our orchard is 100 years. You only planted it 6 or 7 years ago, so it's a 100-year crop. We won't have a rotation there as such. So there are, of course, exceptions. But if you look at where we're having the biggest impact on the planet in terms of negative impact, it's within our arable systems, in our temporary short-term annual cropping systems. That's where we need to rebuild soils. So I think that's where we need to look.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ian. That's been really illuminating, and thank you very much for the conversation.
Thanks, Fiona. See you soon.
See you soon.